Hello everyone and welcome. Make a cup of your favorite drink and get comfortable because this is a wonderful time for news stories from Yellow Cat. Send your own stories in the comments below and maybe they'll be in our new video. Reddit, I just screwed up royally at work. Let me hear your worst work F-up stories, part 2. Right out of tech school, I got a job as a mechanic in a small chain shop. Oftentimes, experienced techs would diagnose a problem, then pass it along to me to do the hard labor. I think that is pretty typical. So, I get this car that needs an air conditioning evaporator replaced. For those that don't know, this is often found way up inside the dashboard and can be a considerable amount of work to extract. This particular one was a beast and fought me every step of the way. Hidden screws, unseen clips, tight spaces. I get it all back together and recharge the AC system. The car goes out working perfectly. As it turned out, the driver was taking a trip across country and I missed a crucial part of any evaporator install: checking the drip valve. All of the accumulated water that would normally drip outside onto the ground was instead pouring inside her car. So she gets back from her trip and the car was soaked. Over an inch of water under the carpet and seats. We had to strip it down to the metal and air dry everything for 2 days. I was a craptastic waitress for a summer in university. Seriously, you did not want me waiting your table. Story the first. Just fresh out of training, I'm tending to a pair of women at brunch. I notice an almost empty coffee mug. Out of the goodness of my heart, I decide to refill it without her asking. As I'm leaning over with the coffee pot, I hit it against a ledge of a separator thingy. Coffee sloshes out of the pot and all over the woman. Woman is livid, I am humiliated. Story the second. It's a busy night and I've been slammed given too many tables. For some reason, I am also told to tend to a table of 8 persons, one of which is the restaurant's general manager. Hoo boy. Cue me effing up everyone's orders, bringing them wrong food, which F's up the orders of other tables, nearly spilling something on a child, etc., etc. At the end, the general manager has a word with me and actually tells me it's not my fault. The manager for the night should have realized how busy I was. I nearly cried in front of him. Story the third. Family slyly requests slice of cake to celebrate birthday of their son. They repeatedly ask me to make sure that it is peanut-free because he has an allergy. I talk to the kitchen and reassure the parents that the cake I've recommended is peanut-free. Deliver cake. Kid needs puffer almost immediately after taking a bite. F. I am a really S waitress. I used to run charges on credit cards as part of my job as a bike parts vendor. One day, I mistakenly charged the bike shop over $1,000. It made the owner of the shop go over their credit limit and get a bunch of fees. I was fired soon after, the only job I was ever fired from. I later moved to the town where that very same bike shop resides. I spoke with the owner and mentioned that I had worked for the vendor long in the past. She told me in detail about the time that her card was charged by accident. I feigned ignorance. Okay, here's a good one of my many. I used to work graveyards doing radio dispatch, and the benefit of graveyards was do whatever. It was always pretty quiet at night, nothing much going on. So I'd step outside, smoke a joint, come back in, fire up the Game Boy and play Link's Awakening or Metroid 2 or whatever. Or maybe just lean back and sleep until the phone/radio went off and woke me up. Anyone here ever wore Dickies? Well, the effing pockets suck. I had reclined in my chair and dozed off. I woke up to take some info on a car one of the drivers had picked up, and I figured I'd slept off my high, so I'd roll another fatty and step outside. I do this. I go to return to my building, and I reach into my pocket, and there's no keys. I look in through the window, and yes, sure enough, next to my chair are my keys. I can't even just quit and go home in desperation without my car keys. I can't get back into work, I can't go home, my cell phone was on my desk next to my weed. I'm 16 million flavors of effed over by the S. Dickies pocket design, and I'm high as F and having a complete and total freakout. In my weed-infused stupor, I had a moment of pure, unadulterated genius. I went to the back of the parking lot, grabbed a big rock, and tossed it through the rear office door. We had no alarm, so I stepped in, unlocked the door, and called my boss and said, "Some effing kids just threw a rock through our back door's window." We were always getting S done like that to the building anyways, due to our location between a housing project and downtown. He wanted to know if I saw anything. I told him I was in the can, and nobody was ever the wiser. Worked as a student in a bank agency. I wasn't 18 yet, so I wasn't allowed to be at the front desk, some insurance issues. Basically, I was doing paperwork in the back. Once, a customer wanted to enter, but one can't walk into a bank. You have to ring a bell and have an employee open the door for you by pressing a button under the front desk. Long story short, he rang, all employees were busy, so I went to press the button. I check under the desk. S, 3 buttons. The man was looking at me, looking pretty peed by the waiting time, so I just press a random button. Turns out, it was the mother effing alarm button. I hate this story. I did it a couple of years ago, and it still makes my blood go cold. I'm a lawyer, and I was doing criminal defense at the time. I was in my office talking with my client about his case. He was in the county jail until his next court date. He was looking at up to 5 years in prison for repeated violations of probation, for possession of crystal meth, and he was really freaking out. He told me he was willing to be a CI, confidential informant, and he knew a lot of things about a lot of people if it would keep him out of prison. So I'm idly taking notes, and I write CI in big letters in his file and circle it. In court a week or so later, all the inmates shuffle in and sit in the jury box waiting for their turn. I go up to my client and open his file to discuss it with him. I notice he is getting more and more agitated, but I'm not sure why. It turns out that the guy sitting next to him is one of the people he is offering to squeal on, and he can most likely see inside the file with the big CI circled at the top. Now, I'm thinking I just got this guy killed. Oops, my bad. Anyways, against all odds, I managed to get him a suspended sentence, conditional on his not testing positive for drugs again, so I think he ended up not being too upset by the end. Still, I learned a very valuable lesson that day. I let myself get caught holding someone else's bag. I work in IT, and a user brought his broken down old laptop to our in-house shop to repair. It was crappy, so I moved it to the back room for repairs. Among other things, the battery was dead. When I started it up, it sputtered for a bit, but eventually returned from hibernation. Biggest shock of my life, there was child pee everywhere. My boss caught me just as it was opening, and I was figuring it out. I didn't get fired, but that was an awkward 2 minutes while I tried to explain it. Bonus, the dude got arrested. I staked out a unit, put wood markers in the ground to indicate location of building, and they poured the foundation walls. 3 days later, I get a call that I put the driveway right in line with a fire hydrant. Now the small company that I work for has to pay to relocate the hydrant, probably $1,500 to $2,000. I may have made the final F up, but whoever did the plans had the hydrant 20 inches from where it actually was. So this story didn't happen to me, but I have a friend who works for an aerospace company, and it's one of the funniest work-related stories ever. To preface the story, when you're building jet engines, you need an unhealthy amount of dry ice. Think one of those fat dudes from the mall, but made from ice inside a box. And there are these fat man-sized boxes lying around everywhere on the assembly floor. Basically, one of the union workers on the floor gets bored one day and he decides to play a prank on his buddies. The 52-year-old father of 3 waits until one of the legally mandated 20-minute breaks and then hops into a box of dry ice and closes the lid. Somehow, he seems to have forgotten the fact that dry ice is not good to breathe. Within 2 minutes, the dude passes the F out, obviously. Luckily, someone had to use the ice for something, so they find this wampa-like creature in the box. Good prank. Now, this is where the story gets hilarious. Because of this prank, the guy has to go to safety training. A lot of safety training. In fact, he gets so much safety training, eventually, he's the most well-trained person in the factory. One day, he is taken aside by the union reps. Long story short, because of some sort of bureaucratic rule system, this guy, who literally climbed into a box of dry ice, becomes the union safety representative for the entire factory. How absurd is that? Let me preface these stories by explaining I write software, so usually things don't get screwed up royally. Usually. My best story caused a small explosion, literally. I was writing C code on an uninterruptible power supply, UPS. Anyway, coming from a more managed environment, I was used to having a variable be 0 when defining its, well, that was how the emulator worked as well. When we actually put it on the UPS, however, it wasn't set to 0, so I started writing to random parts of memory. I managed to corrupt someone else's code, and this UPS literally blew up. The code caused the capacitors to keep charging even after they had reached their limit until kaboom! Fortunately, it was only a small explosion compared to some a few of my colleagues had made, but it was the biggest explosion I've ever made by accident. My second story set a small fire. I was working on industrial scales that were in development. Long story short, I was writing code on experimental hardware. Well, I was the first person to test out a new port on the system. I sent 12 volts of power through a 5-volt bus, and the printed circuit board started smoking and caught fire. Arguably not my fault, but at the same time, I had a habit of running tests and then running off and doing things, so instead of one board catching fire, additional boards melted as well. My last bad experience happened just a year ago. Working as a technical support rep for a wireless communications company, a small rep called up screaming asking why we deactivated a new customer's device. I told him he submitted the activation for the wrong carrier, and by policy, we automatically canceled the activation request. He called me a liar. I went over all the details, he still called me a liar. I told him to check the account himself to see. He demanded to speak to my supervisor because he said I was being rude to him. I put him on hold, went into my boss's office, and told him I have a Jack A sales rep on my phone who's demanding to speak to a supervisor. Except the phone didn't mute the conversation. The headphones are around my neck, and he heard what I said. My boss came out of the office and told me, then said he had to go see his boss now. He came back 10 minutes later and told me I was suspended for the week and to go home and I'll be called in later the day. Later he tells me I'll likely, and did, get fired. I worked for that company for 2 years, underpaid, worked all the overtime they asked, and I was their number 2 rep on the phones. Extensive history of satisfied customers, yet this one Jack A gets me fired. It was my first job offense too, and they just discarded me like I was nothing. Great. Now I'm mad all over again. I worked at Perfect North Slopes as a lift operator during the past winter. I was 17 and was paid minimum wage. The job seemed like it would require some training or whatever, but it's actually quite simple. One day towards the end of the season, I was loading people onto the lift chairs, and since it was towards the end of the season, the snow around the lift had melted, making foot-deep pools of water on the left side of the lift. This was at 10 p.m. by the way. So these 3 heavy-set Kentucky guys ski up and ask me if the 3 of them can get onto a single chair. This particular chair could hold 3 people, some others can hold 4, which is why they were asking. Anyway, I was pretty tired and said, yeah, sure, come on up. So they ski up to the loading point and the chair comes around and it turns out they can't fit in it, so they get pushed up to the lift-off point and completely wipe out. The guy nearest to me fell in the water and almost drowned his phone. The other 2 wiped the F out and lost their skis and poles. Luckily, they were all drunk, so they didn't really give a D. If you want to watch the part 1, click the link here. Thank you for watching. Thank you for subscribing, the likes, and the comments. See you in the next video.